welcome everybody. I'm Amy Litt. I'm the president of the California Botanical Society. I'm trying to put a little bit of light on me because I'm in a room that's totally backlit, and all it seems to be doing is making my glasses reflect, but I think it's still a little bit better. So in any event, welcome to this month's symposium. And our speaker today will be Brooke Rose. I'll introduce her in a minute, but first, let me share my screen with a very important announcement, which is, can you see that now? The symposium, the graduate student symposium. Okay, so yep. We actually think that we're not sure if it's the 30th annual graduate student symposium or the 30th annual meeting, every other one of which has been a graduate student symposium. But at any rate, we're having an in-person graduate student symposium at the newly renamed Cal Poly Humboldt, and it will be on April 1st and 2nd. We are not quite ready to open registration yet, but more information will be coming. And the keynote speaker is a faculty member at Cal Poly Humboldt, Lucy Karhulis. And yeah, so there'll be more information about that. But in the meantime, put the dates down on your calendar. There will be field trips, there will be a banquet, and there will be we hope, a lot of graduate student talks, maybe including Brooke Rose. Okay, so let me introduce our speaker today. Brooke is a finishing PhD student at UC Riverside, and she came to us with a master's from University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where she did it was a master's in geography. She did her thesis on using Landsat phenology curves to characterize post-fire forest responses in South Carolina. Before that, she was an undergraduate at Rhodes College. And I guess with her master's, she was excited about fire. So she came to Fire Central here in California to work with Janet Franklin. Wave, Janet. And she'll be finishing up fairly soon. And so if you know of a job, let us know. And in the meantime, I like to always tell people a little bit of something about the speakers, which is separate from their professional lives. And I think I can speak for everyone who knows her when I say, without a doubt, the most amazing thing about Brooke is that she is an ultra marathoner. And when I say ultra marathoner, I mean ultra marathoner. So she said this past year, she has run 8 50K races, and those are the short ones. She's run a few 50-mile races, she said. And in the past year, she has run 2 100-mile races. So respect for Brooke. With that, and I'm sure she'll be happy to tell you about those experiences. But in the meantime, I will turn this over to Brooke and she can tell you about her research.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was very sweet of you to say. Yeah, the ultra running definitely gives me a lot of time to think about research and think through research problems, not on a computer. So that is one of the benefits of that. And so as Amy said, my name is Brooke, and I'm currently a fourth year PhD candidate in the Botany and Plant Sciences Department at the University of California, Riverside. And so this talk is titled Rarity, Geography, and Plant Exposure to Global Change in the California Floristic Province. And just as a plug, if you're interested in the research that I talk about today, it was actually published 3 days ago in the Journal of Global Ecology and Biogeography, a paper of the same title. And so if you're interested in that, thank you, Janet. Yes, and of course, Janet is also a co-author. She is my PI. And this was put together with a lot of work by a lot of different people, but I'm really proud of this. And if you're interested in it, it's open access. And so I can help direct you to that if you have more questions about what I do talk about today, and any of the methods that I use, because a lot of the methods could be applied to different study systems, which is pretty cool. And so just to get started with this research, it's important to start with an introduction to the study area, which I believe a lot of people in this meeting are probably very familiar with, but it's the Californian portion of the California Floristic Province, which is an area that is located in the western US. The full province does extend north into Oregon, east into Nevada, and south into Baja, Mexico. But just due to some data limitations, we restricted our focus to the Californian portion of this area. And it is a biodiversity hotspot that is home to more than 2,000 endemic plant species, a few of which are shown here, and that I know that this group can definitely appreciate the diversity of plant species that call this region home. And so a lot of these plant species are only found in this area, and so it's extra important to think about how vulnerable they are to global change. And so in addition to its impressive biodiversity, this region is also unfortunately experiencing and will continue to experience a great deal of environmental change over the next century. And so in terms of climate change, temperatures in California are projected to increase anywhere between 2 to 7 degrees Celsius by the year 2100, depending on where you are in the state. And so geography definitely matters in terms of the magnitude of temperature change that's expected. And then that also plays into precipitation changes across the state and different levels of drought as well. And so in addition to climate change, as we all know, California is a very crowded place, and human populations are also expected to rise, potentially leading to double the developed land area by the year 2100. And so within this map, that's visualized as the growing black areas, which are primarily centered around the current urban areas within California. So you can see growing black around Sacramento, San Francisco, and then throughout Southern California, Los Angeles, and especially the Inland Empire and San Diego, which will continue to encroach on the already very threatened coastal sage scrub ecosystems that are down here in Southern California. And so as these maps both show, this environmental change varies spatially. And so species geography and the way that their distributions line up with these different change drivers will influence how vulnerable they are to each of the impacts of these different environmental change drivers. And so to kind of think about how do we measure this vulnerability to global change, there are multiple facets of vulnerability, but within my work, I focus on this idea of exposure. And so exposure is basically the change in habitat area that a species is expected to experience over a given period of time. And so this is an animated visual of a model that I developed for Quercus lizzenii, or interior live oak, under a high emissions climate and land use change scenario. And so in this map, suitable area is shown in color, where green areas indicate areas of high habitat suitability for this species. And then the yellow-brown colors indicate low habitat suitability. And then the gray is basically areas where it's not suitable for the species. And all of this is based on different climate and soil factors, which I'll get into a little bit later in the talk. But for this species, we can clearly see that habitat suitability is predicted to decrease over the next century into the end of century, with areas of vulnerability, especially in the Western Sierra Nevada foothills here, as well as the foothills of the mountains in Southern California. And so I do want to point out that within this research and within this figure specifically, this is only looking at the habitat change dynamics within the species' current range. And so as others who have seen this presentation have pointed out, Quercus lizzenii, as well as other oak species, are moving up in elevation. And so there is dispersal happening even as we speak today. But within this analysis, we were really interested in trying to understand the vulnerability of different species in the places where they currently occur without assuming that they're going to be able to complete dispersal to new areas of habitat. So I just wanted to point that out. And so as the species is predicted to lose habitat, this habitat loss leads to an increase in extinction risk. And so one of the most widespread patterns that we see in ecology is that as habitat area decreases, the likelihood of a species going extinct also increases. And so this is a good proxy for vulnerability. There are other aspects, so thinking about species genetic diversity, as well as their ability to adapt to changing environments. But in this research, we're thinking about vulnerability in the context of this changing predicted habitat suitability. And so that's what we call exposure. And so for this species, we can see that the habitat suitability loss is pretty widespread throughout its range. The story for Quercus wazazzenii is not so hopeful, but that's not necessarily the case for all of our study species. And so there are a range of different stories that I'll kind of talk about today. But in this study, we looked at exposure and the relationship that it has with species rarity and geography for 106 different plant species that are either endemic or mostly endemic to the California Floristic Province. And so a few of them are shown here. I could not fit all of them onto a PowerPoint slide that looked decent. And so all of these species, I just wanted to demonstrate that they represent a broad range of life history strategies and geographic distributions. And so we did that on purpose to try to understand again how their rarity aspects, such as how does their range size and habitat specificity, as well as their geographic position. So thinking about things like at what elevation do they exist and how far are they from the coast? How does all of that relate to their vulnerability to both climate change and land use change? And so in this analysis, for the vulnerability, we're looking at a range of different futures for California. And so if anyone's done any reading on the potential futures of climate change in California, there are a range of them. And so we picked two different climate models that are sort of at the extreme ends for what's expected for California, both a warm and wet model and a hot and dry model, which are the two columns here. And this figure is basically showing climatic water deficit, which is a variable that's really important for plant persistence, especially in an area with a Mediterranean type climate that's very water limited, such as the California Floristic Province. And so here we can see the blue represents areas with lower climatic water deficit, so lower instances of drought, and then the red indicates areas of higher drought or higher climatic water deficit. And so these four maps here show the predicted change under the different scenarios, where the two rows here are the different climate models that we're looking at. So the warm and wet model, and then the hot and dry model. And so these again are at the sort of the extremes for California. And so one of them predicts that California, yes, will get warmer, but it will also get wetter, whereas the other one says, okay, but it will get hotter, but drier. And so most of the models, all of them agree that California will get warmer or hotter, but there is some variability in terms of the level of drought and precipitation patterns across the state. And so again, you can see even in these maps that across changing climatic water deficit, very spatially structured. So there are some parts of the state where there's a big increase in climatic water deficit, especially under this hot and dry model, looking in the Sierra Nevada mountains, as well as the mountains of Southern California as well. And so again, thinking about how that geography can drive the vulnerability of the plant species that exist in those places. And then in addition to climate models, we're also interested in how human decision-making may influence species vulnerability to these different change drivers. And so we looked at two greenhouse gas emission scenarios, low and high, and you can see these as columns here. And the high is actually really business as usual. It would take, I think, a lot of action on the part of policymakers and the government to get us back down to the low. And so you can think of the high as actually business as usual. And so all of these climate data and the climate data projections that we use to predict species vulnerability into the future are from the basin characterization model, which are produced by Alan and Lori Flint. And so they're really awesome. Their data is amazing, if you are interested in that. So those are the climate change projections we're looking at for these species. And what I'll really be focusing on in most of the talk, though, is this high emissions or business as usual scenario. I just wanted to highlight that we also did look at a lower emissions scenario as well. Okay, and so in addition to climate change, one of the, I guess, novel things about the research that we did within this project is that in addition to climate change, which a lot of people have looked at in terms of its impact on species habitat suitability, is we were also interested in the patterns of vulnerability to land use change. And so again, as I talked about in California, developed land areas expected to increase substantially. That includes increases in both developed and agricultural land. And so the land use data that we looked at for this project are from the Integrated Climate and Land Use Scenarios, or ICLUS data set. And these data incorporate social, economic, and demographic storylines with a spatial model to try and calculate the demand for new residential and developed lands. And so you can produce predictions of where is the developed and agricultural land going to be in the future. And so this map here shows the distribution of those different land cover classes as of right now, as of currently, or at least in the late 90s. And so in the green shows natural land covers, the gray represents developed and agriculture, and then you'll see that this yellow category is actually ex-urban, which we treated a little bit differently within this study. And so developed and agriculture we considered to be not suitable for a species. Those are areas of high urban density or row cropping type enterprises. And the ex-urban, though, is more sparsely distributed human housing development. And so these are areas where a species might be able to persist, but that habitat suitability is reduced somewhat. And so that's how we did that analysis and thinking about how those different land use categories influence habitat suitability for a species. But these different graphs, these three figures over here, show the area trajectories for each of these classes through the end of the 21st century. And so as you can see, for the two emissions scenarios, we see an increase in land cover in developed land cover under both emission scenarios, but especially under the business as usual or high emission scenarios. That's this RCP 8.5 with the purple line, and then a somewhat lower, but still an increase in developed land under a low emission scenario. And then again, an increase in ex-urban development, especially under the high emission scenario, but still we see an increase under a reduced emissions. And then, of course, reduction in natural land cover under both emission scenarios. Okay, and so to do this sort of work, we also had to produce species distribution models. And so this is how we get that estimate of habitat suitability and then make predictions about habitat suitability into the future. And so this is a modeling framework that's become really popular in global change studies. But using information about where species currently occur, we can use this type of modeling to understand where species' current habitat is located now and what may potentially happen to it in the future under these different scenarios. And so these models are really rooted in the understanding that environmental factors like climate and soil shape the geographic distributions of species. And so I'm going to kind of walk through an example to give an idea of what this looks like. If you're not interested in the modeling part, you don't have to pay attention to this. It's not totally necessary for the results. But in this example, again, I'm going to use Quercus wozzesenii for just consistency. We can take the species occurrence records, and in this case, we looked at occurrence records from 1980 to 2010 because that's what matched with our climate data that we were interested in building the models with. And so, as we can see, the species is mostly distributed in the Sierra Nevadas, but also the mountain ranges in southwestern California with some coastal populations as well. And so the models take these occurrence records and then we can relate them to environmental factors at those species location data, And we can use environmental factors like precipitation and temperature to construct the species distribution within environmental space, which is what I'm showing here. So I think this will make some sense, but along the y-axis is the average winter precipitation for this time period. And along the x-axis is the minimum monthly temperature for that time period. And so here we can start to kind of visualize where is the species niche within this environmental space. And so the gray area represents all of the locations within the California Floristic Province within environmental space. And then the pink, we can actually visualize, this is where Quercus wozzesenii actually occurs. And so you can see that this specific species does not really occur in areas with really, really low minimum monthly temperature. It actually kind of prefers warmer temperatures when compared to the California Floristic Province overall. And so taking this information for a multitude of variables, we use multiple climate and soil variables to construct these models, but you can take this information and then project it back into geographic space to try to make predictions about where is the suitable habitat within geographic space. And so this here is looking at the occupied habitat area based on those climate and soil factors as a map, where darker colors indicate higher habitat suitability. And so it lines up okay with our occurrences, but we can see here, especially if you can see my mouse, in the northern part of the Central Valley, the model is actually predicting really high habitat suitability, which may have been true at one point, but now that area is dominated by agriculture. And so the step that we use to sort of parse out where is the species current available habitat, we adjust this based on the current land use patterns using the map that I just showed you guys, looking at where is the natural land cover and adjusting the suitability maps based on that to get an estimate of the current suitable environment for the species. And so now we get a more realistic idea of interior live oaks range, where we're no longer considering that northern portion of the Central Valley as suitable habitat for the species. And so again, for exposure, we're interested in the habitat dynamics within this occupied current range. Okay, and so now we've got the current occupied range. The next step then is to look at habitat change under both climate and land use change, and separately as well, within that space for each species. And so what that looks like is we then use those models to project onto the climate futures that I talked about. And for this case, we're looking at the time period 2070 to 2099. So basically that end of century timeframe that people are interested in. And this is what we get. So if you remember, the current habitat looks very different than this. So this is the predicted future habitat for this species within the current range. And so habitat suitability is greatly reduced under this scenario. We can then use the current habitat map and calculate the change between the two. It's very simple, just a math problem basically with mats. And then from there, we basically look at what is the proportional change. So what's the percentage change between that current and future map, and we get a measure of exposure. And so this is a method that's been used by other folks in the literature and the method that we chose. And so what we found specifically with this species under both climate and land use change, we see a reduction of 71% in habitat suitability for this species by end of century. And so we take that and we say, okay, exposure is 0.71. So that is how we measure exposure across the 106 species. And that's how we kind of rank them in terms of their vulnerability. So higher exposure indicates higher vulnerability and higher habitat loss, if that makes sense. Okay. And so we've done all of this for all of all 106 species within our project. And so now we go back to that original question and the question in my title of the talk. In this analysis, we're thinking about how do rarity and geography influence vulnerability. So thinking about those exposure metrics, thinking about that percent change in suitable habitat within a species' current range, how do things like range size, niche breadth, fragmentation, how does all that play into the species vulnerability? And so here I'm showing those different rarity and geographic traits and sort of how we calculated them using both species occurrence data and the occupied habitat data. And so I'll talk briefly about each one of these. But one of the most common rarity traits that's included in vulnerability assessments of trying to understand what are the characteristics that make species more or less vulnerable to global change is range size. It's been proven that this is a very good predictor of species extinction risk, as I talked about. And so for range size here, we looked at the extent of occurrences in kilometers squared. And so that's based on the species occurrence data that we have. And then the second rarity trait that we're interested in is niche breadth. And so this is basically the abiotic environmental tolerances of a species. And so some species have really broad niche breadths where they occupy a variety of different environments. And then some have really, really narrow niche breadths where they really only occupy maybe a certain soil type or a very specific climatic space. And then one that's less commonly used, but that we decided to include as a rarity trait to understand how different landscape structures might influence vulnerability is fragmentation. And so the two factors we were interested in looking at there were number of patches and then also average patch isolation, which is basically just the distance between habitat patches. And so for that, we had to use the occupied habitat maps that I talked about for each species. And so relating the number of patches and then the distance between patches to that vulnerability metric to see if our species with really isolated patch distances more vulnerable to climate change than those that have really congregated ranges and things like that. And then on the other end, I was thinking about rarity and then geography, we have these things that we've termed geographic traits, and those include distance to coast, elevation and topographic heterogeneity. And these are basically just averages of those different metrics across the species occurrences. And so distance to coast and elevation are kind of self-explanatory, but topographic heterogeneity is basically the variation in elevation across a given area. And so here we're looking at the variation in elevation across the species occurrences. And so one idea when thinking especially about climate change vulnerability is that species in very topographically heterogeneous areas or very areas with a lot of variation in elevation may be able to access microclimates. There may be microclimates within their range that can help foster suitable habitat as climate changes. And so that's kind of the idea of including that, whereas species in flatter areas are thought to have to travel much farther distances to keep up with suitable habitat. And so that's one of the reasons we included that. And so these are the rarity and geographic traits that we're interested in looking at the relationship to vulnerability. And so to do this, to look at the relationship between species rarity and geographic traits and their exposure to climate and land use change, we use an analysis known as decision trees. And so these can kind of seem scary and complicated, but they're actually a really intuitive way, I think, to explore and visualize data. I kind of discovered them through this, as well as one of Janet's classes. But I think even if you're not using them for an actual analysis, they're a really interesting way to look at the interactions between different predictor variables and how they influence a response variable, if that's something you're interested in. But basically, decision trees are machine learning tools that iteratively partition data into subgroups based on different criteria so that the resulting group is more similar than the group before it, if that makes sense. And so I think when I walk through this, it'll make a little more sense. But basically in this tree, the little boxes that are bluer indicates a group of species that have lower exposure to climate change, whereas the redder colors indicate species that are more exposed to climate change. So they're more vulnerable. They're predicted to lose more habitat under climate change. And so at every decision node here, the group of species to the right of the decision criteria are more exposed than the species to the left. So that's a good way to think about it or organize it. And then within each node, the top number represents the average exposure across that group of species. The second number indicates the number of species that are in that group. And then the decision criteria is shown below the node, if that makes sense. And so for the first node here, we see across all of the species, the average value of exposure to climate change for this business as usual scenario. I should say that this is the high emissions scenario, was 0.33, which corresponds to a 33% reduction in habitat suitability on average across the 106 species. So that's a third of their range predicted to disappear under climate change. And so the decision criteria that comes first within this decision tree, the one that the model picked out as the most important, unsurprisingly picked out range size. And so the first decision that this tree makes is range size greater than or equal to 14,000 square kilometers? And if the answer is yes, so if the species has a large range size, it gets grouped in this less vulnerable category. And so this is a group of 80 species with an average of exposure of 0.21 or a 20% reduction in habitat suitability. So having a big range size is pretty good so far within the first decision. However, if a species has a range size smaller than this criteria, the average exposure is 0.7, which again corresponds to a 70% reduction in habitat suitability, which is massive. And that is the average for 26 different species. So that's pretty huge, that range size alone can group the species into these two different categories. And I'm happy to take questions on this if this doesn't make sense later. But The model then continues to go through the data and tries to partition it based on these different rarity and geographic traits, saying which species are more exposed, less exposed, and based on which factors. And so what we see here, again, the tree from left to right, goes from species that are less vulnerable to climate change to those that are more vulnerable to climate change. And so I'll start with those that are not so vulnerable to climate change. But the characteristics of these species tend to be that they have large range sizes, many habitat patches, which is really interesting. For the species that are least exposed to climate change, they had more than 6,000 habitat patches, which is huge, many, many habitat patches. They have a coastal distribution. So again, if they do not have so many habitat patches, they get partitioned into this group. And then this decision note asks, how close are they to the coast? Are they less than 46 kilometers? And if yes, if they're coastal, then they get grouped into this lower vulnerability group. So being close to the coast, if you have a large range, is really good. Broad niche breadth and high topographic heterogeneity. So in general, these are what we expected to see. We expected to see all of these characteristics as sort of predictors of low vulnerability to climate change. So that was not too surprising. And so on the other end of the tree, we see that those species that are really vulnerable to climate change are characterized by really small range sizes and then low topographic heterogeneity. So not only do they have really limited distributions, but their distributions are pretty flat. And so as far as I know, this is one of the only studies that looks at this interaction to show how things like geography can sort of magnify vulnerability for different species. So that's a really important takeaway, is that if you take these small range species and then you add a geographic factor that makes them more vulnerable to climate change, you get really heightened vulnerability. And so this is a group of species, of 17 species with an average vulnerability of about 0.78, so almost an 80% reduction in habitat suitability. So really high extinction risk for these species specifically. Though even the small range species without low topographic heterogeneity are still quite vulnerable. And then I think the most interesting pattern that we see within this decision tree is that we find that there is this group of species that gets separated here. 18 different species with an average habitat suitability loss of around 50%. And these, if we go back up through the tree, are some of those large range species. And they are vulnerable if they are far from the coast and if they have low topographic heterogeneity, so really flat distributions. And as you're going to see in a few slides, those are mostly the foothill species of the Sierra Nevada. So many of those species are highly exposed to climate change, and we predict really significant decreases in their suitable habitat. And so that's not something anyone else has really found or discussed within the research, is how these really widely distributed species that we might assume would be really robust to global change, how they might not be if their geography is sort of working against them. Okay. And so for this talk, so I haven't done this before, but for this talk, I thought it'd be interesting because you guys are all plant people, just go through some of these examples and just show you what this looks like. But I just wanted to, again, reiterate the characteristics of the most exposed species are those with small range sizes and then low topographic heterogeneity. And I've included a few of their pictures here, and I'll talk about some of them. But this is going to be kind of a sad part. These are really beloved species. But the first species that's in this group, this is the most vulnerable species in our entire analysis, is Calicortis obispoensis, or the San Luis Mariposa lily. This is a perennial herb that's endemic to the California Floristic Province. It's a very, very small range. It's also listed as a California rare plant rank of 1B.2. And under our predictions here, I show its distribution, and then here the predicted habitat change under this specific scenario only due to climate change, not even considering land use change, which also is not good for this species. But under this particular prediction, we see 100% reduction in its current range under climate change. And so this is definitely a species that we predict to be super vulnerable based on the fact that it has very small range size and very low topographic heterogeneity, not many pockets for refugia for this species. Though we see, even though overall there is 100% reduction, there are spaces within its range that are kind of this yellow color, which indicate retained habitat suitability. And so that's something I'm interested in looking at in the future, is thinking about where are the refugia for some of these species and what sort of is driving those spaces where the species might be able to retain suitable habitat under global change. The second species that is in this category actually has a very similar distribution in terms of it has a very small range, and it's actually a coastal species, is Arctostaphylos rudis, or sand mesa manzanita. And this is, again, a shrub that's endemic to the California Floristic Province with the same rare plant ranking as Calochortus obispoensis. And under our predictions, we see a habitat loss of 92% within the current range. Though this species does have more refugia, especially on the edge of its range, which is kind of an interesting pattern that we don't often see, but very widespread habitat loss for this very restricted range species. And then the last one that I'll talk about within this group is Pinus quadrifolia, or peripinion. And so this is a tree that's endemic to the California Floristic Province, but with one footnote, it does extend into Baja, Mexico. And as I talked about earlier, our analysis was restricted only to the California portion of the California Floristic Province. And so there could be different dynamics if the Mexican populations were included within this analysis. And so I think some other folks are working on that. At San Diego State University, I believe someone is working on that research looking at the species full range, but I think that would be interesting because we are sort of truncating the data. The Mexican populations could add some more information into this model, and so this might not be as dire as it seems, but according to our analysis, we found that this was a super small range species with narrow environmental tolerances as well as high range fragmentation. And so even in the Mexican portions, there's really large distances between the patches for this species. And so that could be playing into how vulnerable it is to climate change. And so for this species, we predict habitat losses of up to 99% within its current range, with very few, if any, refugia distributed in the Californian portion. And then the surprising vulnerable group. So I wanted to show at least one or two examples of these large range species that are surprisingly vulnerable to climate change due to their geographic position. And so from what we saw, species can be very vulnerable to climate change if they have large range sizes, low topographic heterogeneity, and are very far from the coast. And so I've included a couple of examples here. One of those examples that's being shown in this left map is Quercus zenii, which we looked at in the beginning and saw very widespread habitat loss across its range. But the first one I wanted to show is actually Pinus sabiniana, so gray pine. This is a tree that's endemic to the California Floristic Province. It does have a really large range within the province, though I did want to highlight that's sort of relative because it's still an endemic species to the CFP, but it is really widely distributed and it's pretty dominant where it's found. But we see predictions of habitat loss up to 67%, so not quite as high as those really small range species, but really high for a species that might be expected to have a really broad environmental tolerances, have a really large range size. And so this is one of those surprisingly vulnerable species that's really widely distributed within the study area. And this is the case for many of the foothill species, as I talked about. And then similarly, Aesculus californica, the California buckeye, which can be a large shrub or tree. It's often dominant and it's widely distributed again in the foothills, might be expected to do pretty well under global change. But under our models, we predict habitat loss up to 70% across its current range. Again, with many of the darker colored, really huge decreases in habitat suitability within these foothill areas. Though there could be dispersal to higher elevations, particularly in the Sierra Nevada. That is definitely possible. But within its current range, we're finding that it's quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Okay. Now maybe something happy. So what about the species that are going to do okay under climate change? And so there were a big group of species that we found that would be the least exposed to climate change, with, on average, less than 1% habitat loss, which is really fantastic. And so some of the characteristics of those species, and a few of them are shown here. So large range size is one of them, many habitat patches. So this is an example of a species with many, many habitat patches across California. They have somewhat coastal distributions, and then they're also characterized by some degree of high topographic heterogeneity. So they have pockets of microclimates within their current range that may help them retain suitable habitat as climates change. Okay, and so the example I wanted to show for this group of species, sort of the representative example, is Quercus agrifolia, or coast live oak. And so again, this is a very widely distributed dominant plant species. And under our models, we see predictions of actually habitat gain within its range, with many pockets of refugia in the northern parts of its range especially, but we do see some habitat loss here along the central coast. I did want to point out in this map, it's important to see, I noticed this as I was making this presentation. Here you see, okay, what's happening in Los Angeles? Why is it all orange? This is basically just saying that there's no real change. This species has really, really low habitat suitability within the city of Los Angeles. And then there's virtually no change under climate change alone. So it's just a little bit of an artifact of the map. And I did want to point that out in case anyone saw that. But overall, this species does really well under climate change. And I did a little bit of a literature search to see if anyone else has found this. And some folks reviewed vulnerability for multiple oak species within the Western US. And they found the same thing, that Quercus agrifolia was one of the least vulnerable to climate change of the oak species that they looked at. And so I would hypothesize or offer that it's likely due to that coastal distribution, as well as being a really broadly distributed species as well. Okay. And so what's the story with land use change exposure? And so one of the interesting things with this research of looking at both climate and land use change exposure is we can look at how do different rarity and geographic traits play into species vulnerability to these different change drivers, because spatially they differ significantly. And so what we found essentially for the species in terms of land use change vulnerability is that across the 106 species, average vulnerability was much lower to land use change, just because some species were not exposed at all. So many of the mountainous species experience no habitat loss due to development, which makes a lot of sense. But basically an average of 0.12 exposure, so that's like about a 12% reduction, which is still significant because habitat development or development encroachment on habitat will definitely destroy habitat for many of these species. But so for the first decision that gets made within this tree is actually elevation. So elevation position is the most important determinant of species vulnerability to land use change within the California Floristic Province. And so if a species is at an average elevation of 771 meters or greater, they are automatically put into this category of low vulnerability to land use change, meaning that it's the species at lower elevation that are most vulnerable to the impacts of developed land, urban development, agricultural development. And so we built out the tree, and again, the bluer colors indicate lower vulnerability, and then the redder colors indicate higher vulnerability. The main characteristic of the species that are pretty resilient, or the ones that we see low exposure to climate change, are those at high elevations. So those greater than 771 meters, that should say 771. But the species that are really highly exposed to land use change include those at low elevations, so in places where people are building cities and housing and agriculture. And then also we see that even a rarity trait comes here. So those with small and intermediate range sizes are a little more vulnerable to land use change than species with really large ranges. And then finally, again, low topographic heterogeneity is sort of a risk factor for land use development as well, because people are not really building in places where there's really high topographic heterogeneity, because it sort of presents complications for building. And so the species that are most vulnerable to land use change, again, they're at low elevations, low topographic heterogeneity, and those small and intermediate range sizes. So this is interesting. Another 17 species with an average habitat loss of around 24%. And some of them overlap with the climate change species as well, which I will talk about a little bit. But one I wanted to point out, so this is a species, Encelia californica, that actually does really well under climate change. And so I wanted to kind of contrast and compare. So if you only looked at climate change for Encelia californica, which I'm not showing necessarily here, but you would see actually habitat gains. So that's what we observed for this California brittlebush, which is widely distributed in Southern California, and it's really dominant, like it's everywhere. But we see that under land use change, it's actually one of the most vulnerable species within our study system. And predicted habitat loss due to land use change alone is up to 27%. And so this is also a species whose original distribution is also impacted by past development and will continue to be impacted. And so the colors are kind of hard to see here, and I apologize for that. Could have picked better colors here. But again, high habitat loss is indicated by the darker colors. And so we can really see that here along the coast, as well as some darker colors in the Inland Empire and in the areas surrounding San Diego. And so this is a good example of a species that will not fare too well under land use change alone. Okay, and then I did this today and was just thinking about species, thinking about questions people might have, the species that are vulnerable to both. So we did look at an analysis of looking at the combination of climate and land use change, and I wanted to include, these are all species that fall into the far right node in both decision trees of being the most exposed to land use change and the most exposed to climate change. And so I've talked about a few of them. Most of them are really restricted species, pretty much all really, really small range, very narrow environmental tolerances. They span, perennial herbs to shrubs to some trees with Torrey pine and Engelmann oak. So I just wanted to show those as the species that we predict will be vulnerable to both of those global change drivers within California. And so this is 11 different species. Okay, and so the conclusions of this work, as I've talked about in terms of climate change, those small range size species with the narrow niche breadth, flat terrain, and/or also at high elevation are the most climate change exposed. And I talked about Calochortus obispoensis as being one of those species with almost 100% or with 100% reduction in suitability due to climate change alone. Arctocephalus rudis also being one of those species. In terms of land use change, we see again that small range size is a risk factor, as well as flat terrain, and also most importantly being at low elevation really contributes to high vulnerability to land use change. And one of the species that we saw for that as well that fell into the category of both climate change exposed and land use change exposed was Ceanothus verrucosus. And so I wanted to highlight that species because it is quite rare. And then I think so we kind of always known that really small range species are very vulnerable to global change, but I think for me at least one of the most surprising and interesting findings from this research has been this this finding that there are some large range species that are really vulnerable to climate change, especially if they have relatively low topographic heterogeneity across their range. And so an example, as I talked about in the beginning, Quercus wilsonii, we see that under climate change and land use change also a greater than 50% reduction in habitat suitability. And so I guess the takeaway is that large range species can also be really vulnerable, and just because they're dominant now doesn't mean that they maybe won't suffer in the future from the effects of environmental change. And it also is a message to consider aspects of species geographic distribution, so that idea of elevation, topographic heterogeneity, interacting with these rarity traits. I think that's a really interesting concept that can be applied to other areas to think about the sort of stacking effect of these different risk factors for increasing or reducing species vulnerability to global change as we try to manage conservation areas in this age of the Anthropocene as people sort of dominate the landscape. And so that would be my takeaway from the talk. I want to include my acknowledgements. My lab, especially Janet, who is here, who's been my PI through all of this, Santiago Velasco, who was a postdoc in our lab and who still works really closely with us, who helped a ton with this project of just troubleshooting different data model issues, my dissertation committee here, and then I think he's still here, but Ezekiel, I wanted to also give a shout out to my dissertation committee and Ezekiel, or my qualifying exam committee. And I see Ezekiel's here, and a lot of conversations with people sort of shaped my thinking about this research. And so I do want to thank him because he's here as well. So, and this research was supported by a grant from the NSF that was awarded to Janet and Helen Regan at UCR. And so with that, if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Hopefully that was somewhat understandable.
No, that was actually amazing. You know, I mean,
7 p.m. is not my time.
It was just depressing.
It's super depressing.
I mean, I couldn't imagine that it was not going to be, I should say alarming, I guess, but I couldn't imagine that it was not going to be alarming. Yeah, anyway, thank you. That, you know, to be honest, not only was it just really, really interesting, but it also kind of looks like fun. Like those analyses sort of look like they would be sort of fun for me.
I love it. Yeah, clearly. I feel like it comes out when I talk about it. I clearly have a lot of fun with this.
Yeah, clearly, which is great. It's great. We have one question in the chat here. How do you incorporate factors such as wildfires or changes to other factors such as pollinators into your decision tree or analysis?
That's a good question. The fire question is something we've still been like kind of wrangling. That is part of the grant that we're working on, is thinking about how fire is going to change in the future. And if you are familiar with any of John Keeley's work, he does a lot of work with chaparral and fire in California, he says, you know, it's not rocket science. It's like way more complicated than that to try to predict the future of fire in California. But I am super interested. It might not happen within my dissertation or for my PhD, but still super interested in trying to predict how fire regime shifts might play into this vulnerability. But I do think that even some jumps of, well, if a species is really climate vulnerable, they're probably going to be really vulnerable to fire changes. Or on the flip side, if they're really vulnerable to habitat suitability change due to land use, they're also going to be vulnerable to fire change, because those are kind of the two main drivers of fire within California. So in the natural areas in the mountains, it's very climate driven. And then in places that are more urban, it's very people driven. And so I do think that not that they're a perfect metric, but those two global change drivers can kind of get an idea of how vulnerable a species will be to how fire is changing. But that's a really good question and something we're thinking about. Now, in terms of pollinators, I do think, I don't know, I'm sure people are doing this, but you can do things like joint species distribution models to look at how maybe a plant and its pollinator, how the coexistence of that species might change under future climate or land use change. And that's not something I've done, but I think it would be really interesting for sure, because yeah, as Amy said, it's really depressing, but it could be even more depressing if, you know, the pollinators can't get to the plants because, you know, phenology changes and things like that. So I don't know if that was an answer to your question, but those are my, I guess, thoughts on that.
Forrest, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, so I have a two-part question here. First is, were there any free-sporing plants included in your models? So ferns, lycophytes, mosses, because those groups tend to have like fairly narrow distributions within, you know, their habitats. Like they tend to be in like slightly more mesic regions. So I was curious if you included any, you know, like asplenium or pentagrammas, you know, some of these like rarer ferns.
Unfortunately, no, but I do think it would be interesting with what you're talking about, how they do tend to prefer, if they have really, my guess would be if they have really narrow habitat preferences, then they're going to be really vulnerable, especially using the approach of species distribution modeling, which sort of takes that environmental relationship and projects it into geographic space. So if they have narrow environmental tolerances, it's more likely that they'll disappear in the future. But no, we did not include any species within that group.
All right, and then the second is less question, more comment. I work on a group that contains a lot of cryptic species. So my profile picture is of my study group, Isoetes, and like this is just sort of like a, call for like, we need to like really check our taxonomy in when doing these models, because if you have a distribution of plants and it's like, all right, well, we think this has very wide range, but it turns out, wait, no, this is like 7 cryptic species, that can radically change the, conclusions you draw. So again, I'm just, as an advocate for like, cryptic species and accurate taxonomy, I'm just like, I think there needs to be like, in the light of your findings, there needs to be like, hey, are we actually assessing these things as proper species?
100%. I think too, even when you think about different population, I mean, even at the population level, it's like we're treating, all of the populations of Quercus fuselizenii as equal, but, the environmental tolerances of those living in the transverse ranges versus the Sierra Nevada could be different. And so it is kind of a crude way to handle this, but I totally agree with you on that, for sure.
Okay, I had totally forgotten that I had the chat set that it could only go to hosts and co-hosts. So hold up for a second, Travis, and I'll get to a couple that have popped up in the chat and then get to you. How about the impact of microclimate as a factor in the habitat?
Yeah, totally. That's a good question. In terms of microclimates, the resolution of our species distribution models is pretty fine. It's 270 meters. And so my thinking on it is that we were able to detect some level of microclimates, but at smaller than 270 meters, the answer would be no. So there are definitely microclimates, obviously, that exist at spatial scale smaller than that. But 270 meter is pretty fine. And so the basin characterization model climate variables can to some degree detect those microclimates because they take into account the topography of the landscape when they do those climate projections.
Okay, and how do you factor dispersibility in your analysis? While suitable habitat may shift by 2100 meters, I guess, dispersal might not be able to keep up within that time frame.
Yeah, absolutely. So with dispersal, yeah, totally. So within this analysis, the vulnerability exposure factors that I was talking about was only looking at habitat suitability change within the spaces where the species currently occurs. So it's the currently occupied habitat. So we do not take into account any sort of dispersal. And so back to what Amy was talking about, it being really depressing, it could be a little bit less depressing because we don't allow for any dispersal, whereas in real life, there will be dispersal. And so some of these species could be less vulnerable under actual real world circumstances where they're able to access new habitat. But for some, they won't be able to, for sure.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Brooke. Travis, you're up now.
Great, thanks. Really enjoyable presentation. I had 3 questions. I think 2 are kind of already dealt with, but I'll just mention. One is whether fire dynamics were incorporated into the training models, right? And the second, you sort of alluded to a little bit, but I'm curious if you've done any investigation to see if it makes a difference, especially for something like the interior live oak, about including the full range of the species, those 3 or 4 populations down in Baja. And I don't know the answer, but whether or not those would make a difference to the level of tolerance that species has, or whether it's the same climatic niche there. And then, but the real question that goes along with that is, how do you know that these current distributions are climate constrained and not something else, especially for rare species? I mean, how different is this physiology of a Central Coast Calicortus than one that's in the Santa Monica Mountains? And is the climate really the distinguishing factor for that distribution? So yeah, because we've all seen the sort of physiological niche versus the realized niche, and this sort of assumes that they're equal.
Yeah, totally. That's a good question. The only real constraint is that the models were high performing. Like the climate soil models did a good job of picking out where the species occurs. with the occupied habitat, I guess when you get to the realized versus fundamental niche, and maybe this is what you're asking, but we did exclude any suitable habitat that was predicted by the model that wasn't occupied. And so we tried to really constrain the suitable habitat to places where there were overlapping occurrences. So the suitable habitat maps are not just like the raw models projected into geographic space, but they could definitely be constrained by other things other than climate and soil, for sure.
Ezekiel, let me get a couple more chat ones here. How do you think the order of the choices in the decision tree impacts the outcome of conservation concerns for individual species, particularly in contrast to a weighted factor or multivariate analysis?
So the decision tree, maybe this is going to answer the question. I don't pick the order, the decision tree picks the order, but we also did conduct it was actually a univariate regression analysis, just because some of these factors are somewhat correlated with each other, and that can be read about in the paper. But yeah, the order of those decisions would be really sensitive to the data input, and so it's definitely an exploratory tool. Hard to put like statistical significance to the decision tree, if that makes sense.
There's one more here that I think I can probably answer for you. It says, have you looked at herbarium data to see if declines are matching your predictions? And I'm gonna guess that is beyond the scope of your dissertation.
I have not done that yet.
It would be a great thing to do at some point.
Absolutely.
Okay, Ezekiel, please.
Thank you. Great talk, Brooke. I really loved it. Very, very good. It was very enjoyable. I have a question that is probably also beyond the scope of your dissertation, but I think it's important in the context when we are reflecting about climate change. And let me take one example that is familiar probably to everybody here in this meeting that you mentioned, which is the bristlebush, Encilia farinosa. It grows, it's an amazing plant. It grows all the way from close to San Francisco to Cabo, to the Cape region in Baja. And along the Pacific coast, you will find it all the way to Sinaloa from Arizona. A huge distribution. And, you know, you might think, as your model predicts, has a very, very wide distribution. It's probably fairly immune to environmental change. But as you were talking, I remembered I once told exactly this argument to a great botanist who's unfortunately passed away, to Richard Felger. And Richard said, yes, but I can recognize ecotypes of this species, like with an error of less than 50 miles. And indeed, it is a hugely distributed or a widely distributed species, but it has some very specific ecotypes that grow, some of them in very, very restricted and identifiable places. So the point I'm bringing, and I know it's not really the scope of your dissertation, but there is an issue here of genotypes within these widely distributed species that might make them not as immune to climate change as we think, because some level of change in the environment can actually drive to extinction many local ecotypes and make the species way more uniform in its genetic constitution. So anyway, I would like to hear your reaction, just to challenge you a little bit, and because I really enjoyed your presentation a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Ezekiel. No, I think that's really interesting. And I do think that could be like the future of this kind of work, is thinking about how to incorporate genotype data into these species distribution models. And instead of taking the species, is kind of, I think, what Forrest was talking about too, is like not treating it as a single like moving thing, and considering that, well, maybe, you know, I'm thinking about geographically, but maybe the transverse ranges populations of Pinus jeffreyi, maybe they're a little different than the Sierra Nevada, and maybe they have different vulnerabilities, and it could be based on things like what you're talking about, genotype, different genetic expressions and things like that. So I think it would be really interesting. It could be like I think it's on the horizon of this kind of research for sure. Definitely, it's so interesting.
It's
Thank you.
probably, you know, there are always going to be more factors that you can add and more ways that you can drill down into it. So, you know, we can all keep working on it and refining and adding information. So, there are no more questions in the chat. Does anyone else have any other questions? Going once, going twice. Well, in that case, thank you very much, Brooke. As soon as the recording is processed, we'll get it posted up on the website. And I look forward to hearing your defense in a few months.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brooke. Thanks, Amy.
Thank
Good to see.
you.
Good to see everybody. Great job, Brooke.
Thank you, Jana. It's good to see you.
I see your comment in the chat, Janet.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's like, Amy, maybe you've just seen her dissertation defense. I don't know. I don't know. That's,
It's all like a work in
I
progress.
know she has some other chapters, but I don't know. That was pretty good. I think.
No, I think it was great. I think it was very good.
Yeah.
I kind of recycle slides. That's kind of the move. I feel like it really.
Yeah, I
reduces
just want to
work.
steal your slides. So.
Well, you can. Oh yeah, Jan, of course.
Yeah,
I know
but as
you've seen all
everybody's,
this.
I know they're all leaving the call, but I just want all these botanists to know that you didn't know any California botany before 3 years.
None. Zero.
Three years
Oh,
ago,
wow.
and you're
Yeah.
and you're not, you know, you're not trained as a botanist originally, so it's pretty impressive.
You were very convincing, very convincing.
I know, right?
Did you have were there any other manzanitas in the analysis or just?
Yes, there were, Amy. Yeah, and I tried to pick them out specifically for you because I was like, oh, Amy will like the manzanitas. So
Well,
there was
we can talk later.
yeah. We definitely
You should
'cause
just
there were a few
set up
others.
a little meeting with Amy and show her all your manzanita results.
Yeah, I should
Absolutely,
do that.
absolutely,
for sure,
yeah.
for sure. Yeah.
All right. Oh, I
Okay.
see. I just want to shout out to my friends Marty and Liz who are still hanging in here on the call.
Hi, Marty and Liz.
Yeah, it's good to see
Hi,
you, Nick.
everybody.
Yeah.
That was
Hi.
just an amazing talk.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's so
wasn't it?
sweet, you
Was-
guys. Oh my gosh.
It was fun.
Brooke, there's
great.
also a comment that just got
I
sent to me
am-
from Scott White that says, thank you, glad to see someone interested in Quercus lasaniae.
I
I know.
right?
They're like my
We're
species now.
interested in all the really common species that nobody's worried about, right?
Mhm.
Although
30 years ago, I spent a lot of time walking around in that stuff. In the
yeah.
Messina of the Fucodermis.
I mean, that Calicortus bispoensis is a showstopper, but you know, it's
really
also
is,
a goner. I'm sorry to say. It's just going to have to go in the seed bank. We're just going to have to captive breeding.
Growing gardens.
All right. Good night, y'all.
All right, anyone else
Bye,
have any questions or comments?
Anything?
Anybody
Thank you.
still have their Zoom up even though they actually left half an hour ago? All right, Brooke, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you guys so
I'm
much.
gonna close it down now.
Okay. Bye, you
care.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.